Okay, so last lecture, we talked about social stratification. We identified that social stratification had to do with the distribution of what we call life chances, or one's ability to maintain and promote a decent standard of living in a given society. Do you have the access to the things that you need? And we decided that actually, no, that this was not equally distributed in the society, that some people had better access to life chances than other people. And we looked at this in terms of a class distribution. The chart looked a little bit like this, although there's the things in the middle are a little bit different. So what we decided was that folks who are at the top of what we identified as a class system of stratification, right? The layers were defined by what we call social classes. The folks who were at the top had the best access to life chances, right? They had the most virtually unlimited access to life chances, right? Folks in the middle, they had to work, right? They were folks who had to work, but they also had a pretty decent access to life chances, right? And then the folks who were at the bottom, they had the least access to life chances. We divided it up into just three simple classes. Poor working class, middle class, and rich upper class, right? All right, so that is what we refer to as class inequality, right? Those folks are at the top and those folks are at the bottom, and it's a distribution of class. Well, social stratification is kind of synonymous with class inequality, right? With the folks at the top having the best, people at the bottom having the least. But it's not just social class. We don't just see social class being represented here, right? So, for instance, let's assume that that everybody had an equal chance of getting access to the resources, right? But having access to the resources, the more wealth you had in a class system, the greater your access to chances. But everybody has it's all equal playing field, right? So if we assume that there's an equal playing field, that everybody has the same chances to get to the upper class or stay in the lower class, and it's just then a matter of just pure merit. It's just a matter of, everything is equal, right? And if we make that assumption, then what should we be able to see, say, with regard to race? I'm going to use race in this case. So what we should be able to see is that, well, African Americans, who constitute about 13% of the population, should represent 13% of each of these classes, right? We should see that at the lower end, about 13% of the lower end should be African American. In the middle, about 13% should be African American, and at the top, 13% should be African American. Well, what does the actual numbers tell us, right? Well, the actual numbers show that here at the top, we would expect to see 13% of the population of the upper class African American. What's the actual number? Well, the actual number is about 7%. Well, what about the middle class? Well, the middle class we would expect, again, 13% of the population should be solidly in the middle class, should be black, right? But what we see is actually it's closer to 10%. A little bit better than the upper class, a little bit more representative than the upper class, but not quite. We should expect to see 13%. Well, then what does that mean for the bottom percent? What does that mean for the bottom of the poor and working class? And in fact, the numbers that I'm using isn't even. I'm using deciles, and I'll show the distribution in just a moment. But the bottom is closer to 27%, right? Seriously overrepresented among the poor. Well, what's going on? So actually, here's the decile distribution that I have, and it's posted right here. And obviously, there's a problem, right? If we take a look, we should see that all of the different colors should be the same all the way across. So where you see the largest number of people of color, black and Hispanic, I believe is how this is divided up. But it narrows as we go to the other end of the deciles, the top deciles. The number for people of color starts to narrow, but the number for white people starts to widen. Well, why should that happen, right? And, well, it's this that we're using the term, that sociologists use the term inequality. So inequality represents an unequal representation in the social stratification based on the presumption of ascribed group membership, okay? So what we're saying is that um, that we don't have an equal representation of particular groups, that we can identify some groups as being overrepresented within the class structure and underrepresented within the certain class structures. So this is true among, say, African Americans or people of color, um, and it's also, we could also take a look in terms of gender, sexuality, age groups, neurodiversity, ability, handicap. All of these things are areas of inequality. So now, in this case, we're looking in terms of social class, but we can measure inequality in other ways. So, for instance, what percentage of the people who are top board members of Fortune 500 companies are women? We should be able to predict that since women are about 50% of the population, that they're also going to be about 50% of the board members of the Fortune 500 companies. But that's not what we see. We see that your top board members of your Fortune 500 companies are predominantly men. Right? So these are all examples. Now we can look at this, and we can take a look at the data, and if what we see in the data does not match what we should see as far as the proportions of the population, then what we have is a situation of inequality, right? So then the sociologist tries to understand the reason, why do those inequalities exist? Why are African Americans overrepresented in the lower classes and underrepresented in the upper classes, right? And the assumption that sociologists make is that inequality is structural. That inequality is not located in the quality of the individuals, that African Americans are poor because, well, just African Americans are lacking in work ethic or lacking in intelligence or lacking in something like that. No. The sociologist makes the assumption that there are structural and social factors that are contributing to these unequal distributions. And therefore, the sociologist wants to look at that a little bit more closely and figure out exactly what's going on, right? So what I want to do is I'm going to end this here. This is a pretty good way to end this particular video. It's relatively short and sweet. But what I'm going to do is, in the next couple of days, I'll put together some videos. I'm going to talk about racial inequality, and I'm going to talk about gender inequality. Now, there are different kinds of inequalities, right, that we can look at. But these are the two that I want to focus on, and they should give us enough of an example. But we can look at inequalities in other areas as well. And in fact, there are some inequalities that impact men more than they impact women, right? Why? Why do those things happen, right? So for instance, there is a lifespan. Lifespan in the United States is actually declining for working class white men. The life expectancy for working class white men is actually decreasing. Why? What's going on? There's no other, even working class black men and working class Hispanic men, they can at least expect to see at least a small increase in life expectancy over time. But among working class white men, that's not the case. What's going on? So these are all things, these are all things that sociologists assume are structural. So inequality, again, to summarize, inequality is an unequal representation of access to life chances based on what we refer to as ascribed group membership, or group membership based on characteristics that you're born with.